But is there an agreement to transition to democracy?
I think
it sounds
what
like
the
there's
president
not.
pointed out is the obvious. Well, I think what the point, but there has to be a little realism here, okay? A transition to they've had this regime, they've had this system of Chavismo in place for 15 or 16 years. And everyone's asking why 24 hours after Nicolas Maduro was arrested, there isn't an election scheduled for tomorrow? That's
No, I'm
absurd.
asking what you talked about with her.
These things take time, there's a process.
Right, and you
Well,
are...
I'm not going to publicly get into details about any of those things other than to tell you that our expectations remain the same. And we are going to judge whoever we're interacting with moving forward by whether or not those conditions are met. Of course we want to see Venezuela transition to be a place completely different than what it looks like today. But obviously we don't have the expectation that's going to happen in the next 15 hours. What we do have an expectation is that it move in that direction. We think it's in our national interest and frankly in the interest of people of Venezuela.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host Seamus Malekafseli and our producer M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead. We've been tracking the escalating U.S. aggression towards Venezuela and in the region more broadly very closely on this show, mostly in our bonus episodes, but also in our episode from the fall with Alexander Avina. But what happened on January 3rd was truly shocking.
In the early morning hours of January 3rd, U.S. military helicopters descended on Caracas and launched an assault on a military compound in which Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro was staying. 23 Venezuelan soldiers were killed alongside 32 Cuban military personnel and at least 2 civilians. As a result of that raid, Maduro was taken into custody and is now at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, only a few miles away. American Special Forces have long done extraterritorial raids without the authorization of the states they're making incursions into, like with the raid on bin Laden in 2011. But the latter has now been scaled so high, with Soleimani's assassination in 2020 and the massacre of the Yemeni government in Sana'a as a terrorist neutralization op in 2024, that the kidnapping of a president was simply inevitable, just a matter of where and when.
And viewed on a wider timescale, this action fits relatively neatly in the past several decades of the US's Venezuela policy. Since the start of the Bolivarian Revolution in the 1990s and Hugo Chávez's rise to power, the U.S. has attempted to isolate, thwart, and even outright overthrow the socialist government in Caracas. In 2002, the Bush administration covertly backed a coup attempt against President Hugo Chávez, during which he was abducted for several days. The Americans deny having instigated the coup, but admit to having foreknowledge of it, and formally recognize the coup government within hours. The U.S. has also consistently propped up opposition to Chávez and his successor, Nicolas Maduro. And in 2015, the Obama administration declared Venezuela a national security threat in an executive order, authorizing the sanctions regime that Trump then kicked into high gear and Biden maintained. In total, a decade-long attempt to economically suffocate the country.
Juan Guaido, Maria Machado, Pedro Carmona, and a whole host of others have attempted to take power in the same way that Janine Áñez was able to in Bolivia, and all have failed, even with American intervention and, in Machado's case, a military assault, aiding them in their respective battles. Despite extensive American support, both rhetorical and financial, the operation in Caracas earlier this month was not an attempt to install Machado and an opposition Venezuelan administration. It was an attempt to install a regime of extraction exclusively.
But if the kidnapping of Maduro wasn't about installing an opposition party per se, what was the point? Part of the challenge of anticipating Trump's foreign policy moves is that he doesn't operate according to a consistent, overarching program in the way that someone like Obama did. Instead, he has a repertoire of favored tactics: theatrical displays of force, decapitation strikes, gunboat diplomacy, alongside a rotating cast of patrons from his milieu to appease: the Zionists, the Florida Gusanos, the China hawks, the real estate guys. That makes his administration hard to predict, but also hard to interpret. So it's no surprise that in the aftermath of this operation, there's been a lot of speculation as to what's really going on. Is this about stealing oil wealth? Is it about isolating Cuba or cutting off supply to China? Is it about shoring up regional dominance in the face of waning global hegemony?
What we discussed in our conversation with José Ceja in this episode was that idea of spectacle, what the American administration is trying to do versus what its intent is to do. Because there is obviously the stated intent of stealing oil wealth, isolating Cuba. On the day of this recording, Trump has been talking about installing Marco Rubio as the president of Cuba. And he has also announced that no money and no oil will be going to Cuba from now on. Though that has been, I think, the stated intent of the embargo for the past several decades. So I'm not sure what would be different there. But this is despite the fact that oil companies are hesitant to actually get involved in the Venezuelan market, not just because of crippling American sanctions, which forced Halliburton out in late 2010s, but also because it just doesn't make sense for them to invest in such an unstable market, something that has been forced into being unstable. And now it has gotten to the point where Trump is suggesting subsidizing oil extraction, even if it costs the American people money, even if it costs American oil companies money, even if it costs the American government money. The only purpose of it is to make Venezuela a subjugated vassal, to permanently encircle it in American military firepower, and it will always be a consistent supply line. They are willing to expend unlimited amounts of funds in order to make that happen and to send the message elsewhere. And I think our conversation with Ceja was great and illuminated the fine details of that. Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. Things are bad, and they're about to get so much worse. We hope you'll join us. We are speaking today with José Luis Granados Ceja. He is a presenter for Canal 11, Mexico's public broadcaster. He is covering Latin America for Drop Site News, and he is one of the hosts on the Soberanía podcast, which covers Mexico's politics from a left-wing and grassroots perspective. José, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I think it's really important to be here, and been saying yes to everybody who's invited me, but I had to get a special, enthusiastic yes for your show. I'm really encouraged by what you've been producing so far.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Wonderful to hear. So right now, from where Dylan and I are sitting, Maduro and the First Lady of Venezuela, Cilia Flores, are being held only miles away at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, which I believe he's still there after he and his wife pleaded not guilty before the prosecutor for the Southern District of New York and furthermore said that they were prisoners of war. A whole host of justifications, which we will discuss later on, have been provided for why the United States took action against Venezuela. But can you talk about what precisely Maduro and his wife are even being charged with? What jurisdiction is the United States even claiming over Venezuela right now?
This is definitely a case of the United States, as always, trying to apply its domestic laws extraterritorially. There really is no legitimacy to this process whatsoever. And in fact, that's the starting point for all conversation relating to this whole legal process, is that it is not legitimate in any regard. You know, the correct term to use is kidnapping. Maduro was not arrested. He wasn't even abducted. He was kidnapped. You cannot take a head of a sovereign state the way that they did by invading the country, attacking, massacring both Venezuelans and Cubans. Just saw a report, for example, of, they're using bombs that cost nearly $1 million to blow up hospital facilities, these storage facilities for medical devices. And so the place where we should always emphasize is that this is the extra legal actions of a rogue regime that seems to really want to put into practice that might mates right in this world. We're listening to Stephen Miller talking about how, the United States is a superpower and it's going to act like a superpower. We see this coercion around the United States trying to, at the barrel of a gun, force Venezuela to hand over its natural resources that belong only to the people of Venezuela, and only the people of Venezuela should be the ones to decide what happens to it. So this whole process is a total invention. We also saw that the Department of Justice has also said that this accusation about the so-called cartel de los soles, right, the cartel of the suns, they've left it out because, as we've been saying all along before even everything went down this past weekend, that it wasn't even a real thing. It was a total invention, a total fabrication. And so while we could spend some time talking about what all this actually means in terms of Maduro's defense, ultimately, I think really emphasize the fact that this has no legitimacy. And the only correct demand, I think, in this moment is the immediate release of Nicolás Maduro, of Cilia Flores, and their return promptly to Venezuela.
Some of these charges that they're trying to put on him are just so absurd. Like the charge that he's in possession of machine guns as the head of a state, right? Like it just exposes the total absurdity of it. So in announcing the operation, Trump made it pretty clear that his motivation, or one of the operative motivations from the point of view of the US government in engaging in this, was to recover US corporate claims to Venezuela's oil. Now, I mean, this is pretty interesting, right? Despite all of the propaganda aimed at calling Maduro an authoritarian dictator in the Western press, the word democracy didn't appear once in Trump's remarks. And they were even dismissive in the press conference about the prospect of holding new elections. Now, this is a pretty big reversal from the Bush administration's insistence on regime change in Iraq, which was dressed up in language about democracy, and that the resource conquest side of it was only this welcome side effect. But the oil story is maybe not quite so straightforward, right? Venezuela is often described as having the largest oil reserves in the world, but as many commentators have pointed out, the crude oil in Venezuela is extremely dense, making it very costly to extract and refine. And with oil prices depressed as they are now, it's not quite clear that it would be economically viable for these private oil companies to go in and make the kind of capital investments that would apparently be necessary to exploit Venezuela's oil at scale. So I guess my question to you is, do you read this attack as the Trump administration responding to the demands of the oil industry, or is there something else going on at play with Venezuela's oil?
Oil is definitely at the heart of everything that's happening. The control that the United States seeks over natural resources is very much the cornerstone of what we're witnessing happening, not just in Venezuela, but more broadly Latin America, the Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean. And I say that because one of the hypotheses that I have been putting out there is that we're actually before what I'm calling a strategic retreat of the United States. So I think there is a de facto acknowledgement. I think the national security strategy is a confession that the U.S. understands that the fight for total spectrum dominance, which is the language they used to use following the end of the Cold War, has largely been lost. The United States viewed itself at one moment as the only superpower, and it wanted to exercise its authority on the planet as a superpower, but it has a peer rival today. That peer rival is China. And that has happened relatively quickly if you kind of consider the timescale here. And so they're kind of scrambling to figure out how can we get ourselves in a position to be able to dispute global hegemony again, to find a way, because they're not going to give up that fight. They want to be the only superpower on the planet. And so that means they're going to pivot back to what they consider to be their traditional spheres of influence. And, we know what they are, right? Western Europe, Japan, Australia, these vassal states like Canada. But Latin America is a little bit more complicated for them because it's in dispute. Because what they want is not a commercial relationship. It's not a partnership of equals, which would be fine. Certainly I'm here in Mexico, and Mexico's number one trading partner is the United States, as it is for the United States as well, vice versa. What they want is dominance. They want to have cheap, easy natural resources. They want to have cheap, flexible labor power available to them to expand or contract where necessary. And they want to have governments that are totally compliant with them, which means they'll do whatever they say, however they want, at the threat of violence, essentially. And so I think what we're seeing with the oil in Venezuela is about having this sense, and you can see it in their communications, that they control that supply. Because you're right, it would actually take years and billions of dollars of investment to kind of bring them back up to the levels of production that we saw in Hugo Chavez's time, which was, somewhere between 2 and 3 million barrels a day. Right now, it's between 800 and a million. It's kind of always floated around that for the last little while. And so I think that also has to do with the fact that they understand that we could very well, in a very short period of time, be before a situation at the global stage where energy supplies are threatened because of potentially a looming war with Iran. And Iran has a lot more influence over energy supplies because of their control over the Strait of Hormuz. And I think if there really is a serious conflict, a drawn out, something to a larger scale than what we saw recently with the 12-day war in Iran, then they're going to want to have kind of a backup plan. And that's where Venezuela fits in. And that's where they feel they can just dump money in and try to calm markets, calm the oil companies to let them know, hey, you'll be able to do this, and find an alternative source to kind of keep things in equilibrium. That's, I think, a really big part of this.
That centrality of dominance is really important. We had discussed on a previous News of the Week about the hesitation that some oil companies had towards investing in a regime-changed Venezuela. And even though there seemed to be more interest now, based on the fact that the current Venezuelan government is still effectively in power under Delcy Rodriguez, Trump even said that he was willing to subsidize oil companies going in. He was willing to reimburse them, which would cost even more money. It's about the message more than anything, that Venezuelan oil is American oil, even if it costs the United States more resources than is actually beneficial to them.
And I also think they're thinking more in the medium and long term, right? Yes, immediately it might cost them something, but we're talking about the country with the largest reserves of oil. We're talking about 100-year supply of oil. So they're thinking 100 years down the future to know that, well, as long as we can continue to have control over this resources, then we'll be able to experiment and affect the stability in other parts of the world.
And I think that's really critical because you have to kind of read between the lines of what the Trump administration is messaging about this. Because what they're saying is that there is a profit incentive, that there is a kind of logic by which Venezuela's oil is going to pay for itself. And that's the part that doesn't make sense economically, right? There's not kind of immediate profit to draw from this. There's not an immediate corporate incentive. But I like the way that you framed it, because thinking about it in terms of like the geoeconomics of it, of creating this kind of oil empire where US has dominance over production itself in the event of longer term geopolitical conflict, then the kind of imperial logic of it starts to come to the surface. Because yes, maybe bringing more production online keeps prices low. Maybe that's what they want. If they don't want Russia, Iran, other oil producing states in the East to be able to leverage their control over oil prices by cutting production. And then also, yes, in anticipating a potential conflict where oil in the East is cut off, having that hemispheric control over fossil production, like creating a fossil empire, makes sense as a medium to longer term strategy.
And yet, I think there's also something else there that I think is worth pointing out, which is that there's also seemingly an admission that they can't directly control the territories where these resources are found. And so we could describe this as neocolonialism. I think it would be an appropriate term, but they can't really have an empire in sort of the classic sense of the term, because otherwise you would have seen an attempt at an occupation of Venezuela with this most recent military operation there. Instead, there's this kind of gunboat diplomacy, this kind of effort to coerce the interim leadership there to do their bidding. And that's a bit of a tricky thing because obviously as I'm reading some of these messaging coming from the energy secretary and other parts of the White House, it's really disturbing the way that they talk about it. They're going to do what we say and we have control and this will go through US bank accounts and all the rest of that.
Let the oil flow, sell that market to United States refineries and to around the world to bring better oil supplies, but have those sales done by the US government and deposited into accounts controlled by the US government.
That's a very offensive thing for people who put a lot of emphasis on the defense of sovereignty and the decision of the peoples to decide what happens within their territory and their resources. But we have to always kind of understand that this seems to be kind of how they think they can close that gap of an acknowledgement that they don't have really the capacity to occupy a country. Instead, what they're going to do is threaten the life of Delcy Rodriguez, saying, if you don't cooperate, we're going to kill you. And if the people around you don't cooperate, we're going to kill them or kidnap them as well. I mean, this is really quite extraordinary, and I think should offend the sensibilities of everybody who has a minimum of respect for how states should conduct themselves in 2026.
I did want to ask more about the levers that America is trying to pull in affecting the governance of Venezuela, because America has tried to directly rule other countries before, like in Iraq, it, as you said, requires an immense amount of resources to effect an occupation. And with Gaza, that is such a small territory that has been so thoroughly devastated that uprooting it doesn't feel, at least to the Americans, it doesn't feel like that much of an investment. But with Venezuela, they're not attempting to do that, and they're just trying to threaten the lives of Rodriguez most publicly. One, what are the other ways in which they are trying to influence Venezuela? And two, how much are they actually able to do that? Are they able to do this in the long term outside of just the next couple of weeks?
Well, I think they're willing. It costs, I think, something around $18 million a day for the deployment of all of the ships that are there. It's said to be somewhere around a quarter of the entire Navy. The largest aircraft carrier in the world is stationed in the Caribbean. But I think the United States is perfectly willing to spend that and more to enforce this illegal blockade of Venezuela. But part of also their ability to coerce the country into compliance is actually an extension of what they've already been doing. Oil is traded in US dollars, and that gives the United States an incredible amount of power over how it's actually marketed and sold internationally. In fact, because of the de facto blockade on the Venezuelan oil industry, Venezuela's had to figure out creative methods to actually get its oil out into markets. So, they work with intermediaries. They have to give them a discount. As we said, Venezuelan oil is actually kind of expensive, relatively speaking, to extract. And so there's a smaller margin. And even that smaller margin gets eaten away by these discounts that they're forced to offer because they're essentially selling oil outside of the rules that are imposed by the United States. There's no legitimacy to these, but obviously the reality of the situation in the world is that without the US's permission, it gets really complicated to sell this commodity internationally. So they work with these intermediaries. There's even cases of like ship-to-ship transfers. I avoid the term shadow fleet. I think that forces us to kind of admit that the US jurisdiction does actually extend beyond its territories. It shouldn't. But this concept of using vessels that are flagged from different countries or changing the flag or hiding their transponder locations to kind of evade the efforts to quite literally seize these vessels. We just witnessed the seizure this morning. We're recording this on January 7th of a vessel that had been chased basically around the globe. So it shows the determination of the United States to really actually enforce this. And while we're on this topic, this is largely all governed by rules set out by the U.S. Treasury Department, specifically through the Office of Foreign Asset Control. And it's interesting because you can look into the actual legality within the framework of the United States legal system. You can sanction entities, you can sanction vessels, right? You can sanction individuals, but you cannot sanction commodities. And yet we have now Hegseth, Rubio, Kristi Noem, all talking about sanctioned oil, when that's not even a concept. That's not a real thing. There's no such thing as sanctioned oil. It's not even within the framework of the United States legal system. And yet here they are, lying to the American public about the existence of sanctioned oil to justify what they're doing. So even with constraints of the US Constitution, they're acting outside of it. And it shows that just how far they're willing to go to really enforce this, to make it so that the present government, again, insisting at the barrel of a gun, has its hands tied in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it kind of gives the game away, right? When they're talking about sanctioned oil, it just reveals that the entire purpose and function of this form of sanctioning system is to collapse the economy of Venezuela. It is to prevent them from using oil in order to build up their foreign exchange reserves that they need to run the economy. It's to intentionally cause the kind of inflation we're seeing in Venezuela, but not only Venezuela, in Iran as well, to achieve their political objectives. And that's the thing about the Trump administration, right? It's not necessarily that these tools are new, right? We've seen this form of sanctioning for multiple administrations really for the same ends, but they're the ones who are willing to admit it. They're the ones who are saying, yeah, we're going to do this blockade because we want to harm the Venezuelan people. We want to harm the Venezuelan people so that we can strong arm the government into doing what we want, into letting us control their oil, into letting us impose our immigration policies, etc. And so I've been struggling with this question of break and continuity, right? In some sense, what the Trump administration is doing here is this gross deviation from the rules of the game here, the rules-based order, what have you. And in some ways, it represents this capstone, this pinnacle, this continuity, especially of the post-Cold War order and mode of American dominance, right? I think that no one can look at what happened and not just think about the abduction of Noriega and the trial, but also think about Iraq. So it's just really interesting.
You know, the word I kind of settled on is vulgar.
Yeah.
It's the same old imperialism, right? It's still the structural motivations behind a world system that is designed this way to facilitate the accumulation and the value transfer from the south to the north. That's always been the constant, but it's just more vulgar, right? It's just more honest. You know, we had Tom Cotton just the other day saying, as openly, this is about punishing the Venezuelan people. We want to make them suffer. They're not going to be able to pay salaries if they don't do what we say. It is, I think, in some ways, a continuity, but some ways also a new era. But if that's the case, then that also should inform us in terms of what our response should be. And I really think that this is a wake-up call. This is a really major wake-up call for all of us who I think maybe allowed ourselves to fall into a bit of complacency about how much a liberal democracy will allow you to actually transform the domestic relations, yes, within a country, but principally how a nation state interacts with the world system. That part hasn't been touched. And I think that's the part that's really making us realize that it was a mistake to not really go after it when we had more forces in our favor.
The phrase wake-up call also reminds me of what I wanted to ask about what has happened with Machado and other people in the Venezuelan opposition to Maduro. Seeing these groveling interviews on Fox News with Sean Hannity talking about giving the Nobel Peace Prize to Trump even more now, clearly angling for some sort of power. Why were these people like Machado, like Edmundo Gonzalez, who claims to have won the last presidential election, like Juan Guaido, why were all of these people sidelined during this process, whereas willing puppets like Ahmed Chalabi in Iraq or Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan got to be elevated to power, got to actually get the goods, as it were?
That's a fantastic question. And, you know, this is an audio program, but if you could see me, you'd see the smile on my face when you mentioned Trump's thrashing of Maria Corina Machado, because the truth is that's always been the case. There has been a really deliberate effort to elevate her into something that she never actually represented. I'll start there with her because she's probably the figure that most people are familiar with. She was always a creation of the United States. She became more well known when she went to the White House, and there's this picture of her that's famous where she's smiling ear to ear next to George W. Bush. You know, she created this organization called Sumate, which was designed to facilitate the recall referendum against Hugo Chavez. And that was the product of U.S. soft power, you know, the funding that came from the State Department, from USAID. And she's always been a hardline far-right figure in a country that is very unequal, that is very poor. You know, everything she promised, people weren't interested in buying. even within the Venezuelan opposition, she was a marginal figure. There's this also very famous exchange that she had with Hugo Chavez, where she was criticizing his expropriations of certain industries, saying it was theft and the rest of it. And he really, in a comical way, brushes her off, says, "You haven't even won the primary. You're out of ranking when it comes to me. An eagle does not hunt a fly. Águila no caza mosca." It's an amazing exchange.
Yo primero le sugiero que gane las primarias, ¿verdad? Gane usted las primarias. Es lo primero que tiene que hacer, porque está fuera de ranking para debatir conmigo. Está fuera de ranking. Lo lamento mucho. Lo lamento mucho. Pero esa es la verdad. Ya que usted me llamó hasta ladrón, así me llamó ladrón delante del país, no la voy yo a ofender. Águila no caza mosca, diputada. Bien.
And it spoke to the fact that she was nobody back then. She was just a lawmaker, right, who represented the fringe of an already hardline right-wing opposition. But obviously, yes, I mean, we've seen her profile elevated. And that, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that the Venezuelan opposition has been incredibly hapless, just totally incompetent, not even able to leverage the interference of the United States into their favor, and always acting as an extension of U.S. power inside of Venezuela, right? They didn't do anything without the permission of the United States. You know, all of the whole Juan Guaidó farce, the circus, was a U.S. creation. And the reason I can say that confidently is because I remember when he declared himself president in that plaza in Caracas. And I remember that as that was happening, we saw this statement after statement from other countries. There was a particular emphasis on getting right-wing countries in the region to say, yes, we recognize Juan Guaidó. And that to me spoke of the fact that this was clearly coordinated. This was clearly, many phone calls were held beforehand to say, he's going to do this and you have to come out and say it. And as a side note, I always highlight the role of Mexico in that moment, because by then, Andrés Manuel López Obrador was president, which obviously represented also a shift for Mexico's foreign policy. And Mexico, who's a regional heavyweight, said, we are not playing this game. And I think that was actually really important to stop that momentum that Guaidó was definitely actually accumulating that morning of kind of convincing the world that he was the leader. But then, you know, it petered out. He was the leader of a fake government that stole resources that belonged to the Venezuelan state, you know, a price that the Venezuelan people are still paying now with the loss of Citgo, for example, which is a fully owned subsidiary of the state oil company PDVSA. But he's not the only one. You know, there's also Enrique Capriles, Leopoldo López. All of these figures have never really been able to actually penetrate Venezuelan society. These are not popular people. There is obviously opposition to Maduro and to the Bolivarian Revolution, as there is in any country, really. But it's this idea that somehow they actually commanded a majority of support in the country was never true. And with Trump basically saying as much in that confession, saying, well, she doesn't have the respect you need. And it's true. She wouldn't. In fact, it appears that the United States is betting on stability with Delcy Rodriguez as opposed to trying to install her, because they know very well, due to the lack of support she would actually find beyond her base, right? She definitely would have a core group of supporters, a significant chunk of the population, I think short of a majority, really. Not to mention that if she actually implemented her program, it would make things far worse for the Venezuelan people. That putting her in would actually be much, much worse. And we actually, and this is part that I think is also what's at the top of my mind as things are progressing in these days following the abduction, the kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro, is that we could also potentially be creating a scenario where there is the Balkanization of Venezuela, right? The actual territorial integrity of Venezuela is at stake at this point. That's why you see, for example, Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello saying, dudar es traición. To doubt is to commit treason, right? The emphasis has to be in this moment, unity. Unity above all, to actually protect the very viability of Venezuela as a nation state, given everything that is before them in this moment, principally the ships and the thousands of troops that have all of their guns pointed right at them off their shore.
I do see Machados in waiting all over the world, but I'm thinking in particular of Iran's case, which is currently being rocked by protests over increasing costs of living. When I saw what Machado was trying to do after Maduro's kidnapping, I was reminded of when Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Shah, went to Israel in early 2023. And he attempted to get a meeting with Netanyahu and was afforded something in this back room on two metal chairs like you would see in like a church basement. And Netanyahu posted on his official Twitter account about steak knives and other things that he was doing that day, but never mentioned Pahlavi. And throughout that war that Iran was subjected to, thousands of people were killed. Reza Pahlavi effusively praised the weakening of the Islamic regime.
This regime is defeated, teetering on the edge of collapse, and must not be allowed to continue. The time has come to end this ruin and begin a new era for Iran. This is a new dawn for Iran's lion and son.
And got nothing out of it. And he seems to be trying to do that again. I don't think that the threat of puppets of the American government, that threat of other people like that being installed in other countries is gone. But I do wonder if this will have any sort of larger effect on other people who are trying to be subjugated by the United States. If someone like Machado, who literally got the Nobel Peace Prize, will not be given anything for it, I mean, do you think that that will make anybody question trying to get American influence, trying to get in on America's good side?
I think vendepatrias is what we call them here in Latin America, sellouts to the homeland, will always be the way that they are. They have no actual convictions. They have no love for their homelands. These are, for example, in the case of Latin America, often them, they're white descendants of the colonizers, right? They don't feel a connection to their territories. And even if their ancestors are buried here, they don't have respect for the land. They'll always be that way. But I do think there's one factor here that is worth underlining, which is that the Bolivarian Revolution is a revolution. You know, we're talking about millions of people who had a political awakening, who are deeply involved in the actual management of their lives and their communities and their territories, especially those who are organized in communes, for example. It's something that rarely comes up when we talk about Venezuela, but is actually the heart of the socialist project there. And in fact, to Maduro's credit, once he was able to kind of pick the pieces back up of the economy, immediately pivoted back to the commune. I have to remember what was Hugo Chávez's last will and testament, or at least read as such, was the golpe de timón, the strike at the helm speech, that last cabinet meeting he had before he died, where he made that famous phrase, comuna o nada. And he said it with a lot of conviction, but almost some rage behind it. Commune or nothing, right? Of actually saying we have to finish away with this old order, this representative democracy, and move into something that actually transfers authentic popular power into the hands of the people. And so that means that, you know, Machado, someone like her, is trying to govern over a country where people have an idea of what it's like to actually break outside of that mold of representative democracy, and who are not just going to limit their political participation to voting or marching, but, you know, of actually exercising control over their resources, over production, over their relations to the territory, to their neighbors, to everything that's around them. And so I think that part is also really important. And really, there is a domestic element there, which again, I think is important for the rest of the world to pay attention to. Possibly, if that element wasn't there, there might have been an attempt to put Machado in, because there wouldn't be an appreciation for a kind of pushback from the grassroots. And I want to say something about that as well. So Saturday's events happen. I'm in the central time zone, which is a couple hours behind. So I woke up early in the morning. I start seeing the messages of what had happened. But I also started getting messages from my comrades down there, who immediately went to their commune and said, let's go get our weapons. We have to defend our territory. This is the invasion. Obviously, we know it wasn't an attempt at an occupation. And so, you know, they ultimately didn't put themselves in a position to fight off the gringos who had invaded. But that was their first instinct. We have to go get our weapons and defend our country. And that is a product of a 20-plus year revolution, where people understand that that's also part of it, right? And of course, there is a historical memory here in Latin America. People remember the coup against Allende. That coup may not have succeeded if they'd actually given weapons to the workers, as some of the movements there had demanded before the coup had happened. We have to remember there was actually a previous coup attempt against Allende. And after that, people said, arm the workers, we know what's coming. So Hugo Chavez learned that lesson. He used to always say, our revolution is peaceful, but it's not unarmed. And I think this is where it's important for us to appreciate that, you know, it's important, yes, to participate in bourgeois democracy and vote for candidates that represent a transformation. And, you know, here in the case of Mexico, for example, when the president says we have to defend our sovereignty in the face of Trump's attacks, come out to the Zócalo and 500,000 people show up. That's all very important. And I think a very, very important message. But given the reality we now have before us in 2026, it's not enough anymore. We have to get better organized. We have to understand what it means to actually wield control, to actually wield power in a way that frightens all these vendepatrias who are willing to sell us out to the gringos.
I'm really glad that you brought that up because it gets to the heart of something that I've been thinking about, which is the relative balance of influence between the competing logics within the Trump administration. I think that the logic we're very familiar with is the Marco Rubio type logic, right? Extremely ideological, kind of coming out of the Cold War that might lead one to expect an elevation of the Venezuelan opposition, Machado, etc. But I think there's another competing logic, right, which is a skepticism of the kind of neoconservatism of the Bush administration that is fearful of getting involved in long entanglements. And I think that there's a certain pragmatism to, if we're contrasting Marco Rubio with the more Stephen Miller vision of hemispheric dominance, right, that thinks, okay, well, realistically, if we actually want to engage in regime change, that would take a land invasion, right? Because there is a government that is in power. The opposition doesn't have the infrastructure. We can't just decapitate the Maduro regime and the opposition is just going to waltz in. That would take a land invasion. That land invasion would spark an armed resistance because of what you're talking about. And we don't actually want to get involved with that, right? And so I think it's worth thinking about, okay, if the Trump administration sidelining the Venezuelan opposition indicates that this is a Stephen Miller influenced operation, maybe perhaps even more so than a Marco Rubio one, then I think it's worth bringing in the broader Stephen Miller vision, which is really built out around immigration, right? And there are hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 1 million Venezuelan migrants in the United States, and about 350,000 of them who have or had temporary protected status as they seek asylum. And throughout this year, the Trump administration has been in a fight to remove that status in the courts. So my question for you is, we've talked about the oil logic, we've talked about the ideological logic. Do you think that there is a play here that is related to removing the temporary protected status for Venezuelan migrants, or also potentially a play here involving strong arming the government in Venezuela into accepting deportees? This isn't really something that's been reported, but I wanted to get your sense as someone who is thinking about these issues.
Definitely. When we think about Stephen Miller, the first thing that should come to mind is that white supremacist logic that's at the heart of everything he does, that has been true of him since he was a teenager, right? These videos of him speaking in really disgusting ways about people of color in his life. And so I think definitely it is a factor. Interestingly enough, despite everything that happened in the lead up, the extrajudicial executions in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, the gunboat diplomacy, the sanctions, the unilateral coercive measures, all of this, the deportation flights actually was always a constant. Even when they suspended flights to Venezuela, the only ones that did have authorization were the deportation flights. And so, yeah, that's a big part of what they're doing. And they're probably playing the waiting game right now, but you can be sure that they fully intend to kick out all of those Venezuelans that are with them, that support this invasion, this action, the kidnapping of Maduro, right back to Venezuela. And I do think that part of it is to say, well, now there's stability. We have a government we can work with. We can consider them partners. There's no longer this tension. We could even see the reopening of the embassy. Apparently, there's moves at the State Department to make that happen, which would make it so that they can make that case before the courts to say they don't need TPS anymore, because the situation has stabilized. And so now all of those can go. And that's definitely something that Stephen Miller wants to do and is doing everything possible to make it happen.
Do you think there's also an attempt to get buy-in from other Latin American states, like reactionary states that themselves have an influx of Venezuelan migrants?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's become a very serious issue domestically in most countries that have large populations of Venezuelans. I think, for example, the result in Chile in a lot of ways was influenced by the rhetoric of Cast, who's a far-right reactionary, a fan of Pinochet, the son of an actual Nazi, bringing this into the campaign, saying the first thing he was going to do was to kick out all the Venezuelans, that they had, X amount of days to get out of the country. And so I think part of that has also really kind of penetrated into some of these countries. But on that point, we should also emphasize there really was what was deemed a call effect. There was a deliberate policy at one point to promote emigration from Venezuela as part of the regime change effort, to picture it internationally, to depict it as a failed state that was unable of being able to take care of its population, and therefore it was, a regional crisis. In fact, some of the language that has happened since the kidnapping of Maduro has been, this is what happens when the region doesn't know how to respond to crises. No, this was an invented crisis. You wouldn't have seen these waves of migration had it not been for the unilateral course of measures, had it not been for this de facto blockade on Venezuela's oil industry. It's a very wealthy country, and in the best days, at the height of the Bolivarian Revolution, that wealth was being spread around, and people who had never seen a doctor finally did, for example, with Barrio Adentro and all the social missions. And even then, right, under the hardest of circumstances, housing is, I think, a really key issue for people in the United States, for example. Maduro's government built over 4 million units of housing in a very short period of time to use that country's oil wealth, to spread it around, to give it back to the population. And so, this punishing campaign, this effort to try to depict it as a failed state, promising millions of dollars to countries like Colombia, Peru, Chile, to accept Venezuelans as they were leaving Venezuela because of the crisis that was produced by the United States in that country. And now, the effect of that is now the sort of the reaction. You convinced people to leave their countries. You made life so difficult that many people felt like they had no choice. Here in Mexico, I don't live too far from the bus terminal, and it turned into a de facto campsite for a lot of migrants. For a while there, it's no longer the case, but it's actually the route that I would take almost every morning to take my kids to school. And so I would often have conversations with them. And even then, you would talk to Venezuelans, and I would ask them, so, if the situation improved, let's say the government doesn't change, but the economy improves, would you go back? And they're like, absolutely. They wouldn't doubt it for a second. They're like, of course we would, right? We're only leaving because we feel like we have no choice. And so it's really quite perverse to create that scenario, to punish a country so much that people feel like they have no choice but to leave, and then to use that to advance these kind of reactionary candidates and ideas who use xenophobia as part of their strategy to get elected. And then once in power, become very close U.S. allies to once again do things like what Bukele is doing, which is to create these centers of torture and human rights violations where people are imprisoned in deplorable conditions. It's all quite perverse when it all comes together.
You had brought up Colombia, so I wanted to ask about Gustavo Petro and the threats against him. The threats against him started up almost immediately after Maduro's abduction, alongside threatening Greenland and Mexico. Petro, I don't know if the right word is goading. I think he would probably phrase it differently. But he has been saying, if Trump wants to take me in an orange jumpsuit, then the Colombian people will rise up and protect me. There have already been moves in Bogota's direction. There were the strikes on the boats in the Pacific that were occurring several months ago, and his family is already on the OFAC sanctions list. But is there an actual major threat of a raid of the kind that happened to Maduro against Petro, even though he does not have the same accusations of illegitimacy that Maduro has?
So I think in the case of Petro and Colombia, there are still certain constraints on U.S. actors. And so that's why you see Rubio going to great lengths to talk about the law enforcement operation against Maduro, right? To try to kind of put it in those terms, because there still has to be some kind of deference to the U.S. legal system to try to justify what they're doing. That's not really available to them when it comes to Petro, right? It's not the same kind of situation. You're right. He doesn't have that shadow of illegitimacy over his. The strategy, I think, is different, but there's elections in Colombia. And we just saw the way that the United States, Trump specifically, and Besant interfered directly in the Argentine elections, promising them. It's a country that is facing a very difficult economic situation. And when they promised them a cash bailout, well, I think that actually, as we saw in the results, affected people's decisions when they were in the ballot booth deciding who they're going to vote for. And ultimately, when it looked like the Peronistas were going to win, ended up giving actually a huge victory to Javier Milei's political party in the legislative elections. A really important victory, actually, that allows them to avoid the veto now. We also have the example of Honduras. I was actually in Honduras for that election and covering it. That interference where Trump called for the population to vote for Nasri Asfura changed the result, indisputably. I talked to people who said, well, we can't really risk having a poor relationship with the United States. We're a small state. We depend on that commercial relationship. We depend on the remittances that come from our family members. There were people who felt like if they didn't vote for Trump's candidate, then they would cut off their remittances, which would mean that they would be condemned to mass poverty. And it affected the result. It looked like the winner was going to either be Rixi Moncada from the Libre, the incumbent party, or Salvador Nasrallah from the Liberal Party. But ultimately, that interference by Trump made it so that the Conservative Party, the National Party candidate, is the one who came out on top. There was also a lot of election irregularities, and it's not really the object of this conversation today, but it shows just how far they're willing to go. And it's interesting because there used to be, as you said, Dylan, about this emphasis, even from Bush, but also particularly from Obama and Biden, about, the defense of democratic rights and civil and political rights. It is a clear and open violation of the Hondurans' political and civil rights to freely elect their own representatives. And yet, the OAS, which often brags about its efforts to preserve democracy in the hemisphere, it's kind of one of the jobs it does consistently, I wouldn't say effectively, but consistently, these election observations, couldn't even mention it, couldn't bring themselves to mention Trump's violation of the Honduran political and civil rights. And so there's really not enough elements to stop the United States from doing whatever they think is the most appropriate move when it comes to asserting their dominance over countries in the region. So in some cases, it may be efforts to kidnap a president or to threaten the life of the sitting executive. But in other cases, it's about promising them a cash bailout. In other ones, it's just openly interfering in the election. So it's wide open for U.S. policymakers in terms of what they think they can do. I think Colombia, in particular, will be an interesting case study. What are they going to do there to try to stop Ivan Cepeda, who is the left candidate there, from being able to win? They have a complicated scenario before them. This is a difficult country for the left to win in for a lot of reasons. But nonetheless, they're going to try to tip the scales one way or another. And even if he does win, there will probably be an effort to delegitimize his victory.
I want to ask in particular about Mexico. We talked about how the U.S. maybe hasn't laid the groundwork in the way that it had against Maduro as an individual for this kind of military snatch and grab kidnapping and other ways in which it can exert its leverage. But the situation in Mexico is a little bit different, or maybe somewhere between those two poles of policy, in that the U.S. has slowly been ratcheting up its kinetic aggression on the southern border. And there has been an increased chatter on the right about military intervention against the cartels in northern Mexico. But obviously, Mexico and Venezuela are extremely different. As you mentioned earlier, Mexico is a massive country that is extremely economically integrated in the United States. So how seriously are the Mexicans taking the prospect of military aggression from the United States? And does this operation change that risk assessment?
I think the Mexican government, led by Claudia Sheinbaum, understands that the threat is very real. And I think it has been a big part of how they've approached the relationship. It's difficult because, as you just well said, Mexico has a very deep economic integration with the United States. And that's a product of the free trade agreement from 1994. We're talking about decades now. That's not something that's quickly reversed, nor would it even be feasible to even try in this moment. And so the way that Claudia has been trying to leverage that relationship is by saying, listen, you actually can't go it alone. If you're thinking about global hegemony, if you're thinking about how to compete with China and the Asian markets, you need Mexico. And so continue to respect our sovereignty, respect our political destiny, how our country organizes itself, the legitimacy of the government, and we can work together on this. And so far, it's worked quite well, actually. Trump is basically an admirer of Claudia Sheinbaum. He always speaks really highly of her. But we have to be honest. The United States definitely has every intent to engage in kinetic action inside of Mexico. In fact, the reason they started attacking boats in the Caribbean was a bit of an olive branch to the Florida Gusano lobby. So the Florida lobby, these rabid reactionaries, anti-Maduro, anti-Bolivarian revolution, anti-Cuba, all the rest of it, they were really upset with Trump and were actually using their votes to coerce the Trump government to do more against Venezuela. And their principal demand was actually to have Chevron's oil license suspended. Trump didn't want to do that. And I think we've seen why, right? He's clearly putting his bets on trying to get U.S. oil companies into Venezuela again. And so instead, they said, well, we've been thinking about bombing Mexico because we really want to do this. We want to send a message to say that we're serious about going after narco traffickers. So we're going to do it there first. And it was the plan B. Plan A is to attack Mexico. And so that it hasn't happened is actually a testament to Claudia Sheinbaum's defense of Mexican sovereignty. She's been really insistent on it. And Trump has been talking about this recently. They asked, well, a lot of the drugs, you say this is about drugs. So they actually mostly come from Mexico, especially fentanyl, which is kind of the key one that they're worried about in this moment. And he says, well, yeah, something has to be done. Well, in response, he also says, I've offered to send troops. I've offered to use U.S. military firepower to go after the drug cartels. And she always says no. And he says that she says no because she's scared of the cartels, which is a ridiculous notion. But for me, it is actually an acknowledgement on his part that he actually doesn't understand what it means to defend sovereignty. He doesn't understand that that is a red line, that we're not going to permit foreign activity, foreign boots on our soil in that way, and killing Mexicans who would likely also, there would be lots of casualties who are not even remotely connected to narco trafficking, right? And so she has been really good about emphasizing that this is a non-starter, this is a red line. And I think, this is now speculation, so take it with a grain of salt. I think she understands that the Mexican population is willing to go to extreme lengths to defend its sovereignty. This is a country that lost half of its territory to the United States. That's not something we've forgotten. And so if it comes to it, if there is this kind of action, I expect a very, very strong pushback from the government. And if it isn't, I expect the Mexican population to demand a strong response that could include the suspension of commercial relations with the United States, which would be devastating for us. We have to be honest, right? Like that would destroy the Mexican economy, but it would also really hurt the US economy too. It would create a domestic crisis for the United States. We have that leverage over the United States. People like Stephen Miller think they have all the power. You don't. And I think that if that did come to pass, then you would see a population here that is also willing to endure what's necessary to send a message that we're not going to accept that. But again, this is all speculation. I think in the present situation, like I said at the very beginning of this response, Claudia finds herself in a very difficult situation because you don't want to provoke him either. I always use the counterexample of Canada. We have a very similar relationship, Mexico with the US, that Canada has with the US. And things are not going well for the Canada-US relationship. Mark Carney is in a bit of an even tougher situation than even Claudia is. And so I think her condemnation of the U.S. action against Maduro and Venezuela more broadly was very important. But she's also been clear to say, because she's been grilled on this, Trump seems insistent on doing something in Mexico. She's like, no, that's not going to happen here.
A raíz de los hechos recientes en Venezuela, donde el gobierno de Estados Unidos llevó a cabo una intervención directa que derivó en la captura del presidente Nicolás Maduro y su esposa, así como en la pérdida de vidas humanas, México reafirma un principio que no es nuevo y que no admite ambigüedades. Rechazamos de manera categórica la intervención en los asuntos internos de otros países.
No, they know that that's not going to happen here. And, Marco Rubio was here not too long ago, lavishing praise on the Mexican government, saying, oh, we've never had a closer relationship. So there has been some concessions in that sense. But there's also been, I think, a really important message sent that I've been talking a lot about. So there is also a very close military relationship between Mexico and the United States, especially around drug interdiction. And in order for Mexican troops to travel to the United States for training or US troops to come into Mexico, there has to be special permission from the state. To do that, the Mexican Senate had to go through basically kind of a multi-layered process to approve it. That was meant to happen this month in January. After what happened to Maduro, those meetings were canceled. So I think those kinds of actions are important to send a really clear message. You've gone too far, and we're willing to say no and actually have that no translate into concrete action. And I think that is just the beginning. There needs to be far more of that. But again, with the knowledge that there has to be a certain amount of prudence because Trump is so unpredictable and could lash out and do something to us.
I just want to follow up briefly, because you mentioned the Gusano lobby. And another player here that we haven't spoken about that extensively is Cuba. And Cuba has long been in the crosshairs of the Rubio clique. One of the stated factors here is Venezuela as an oil supplier to Cuba. But there's been some reporting recently that it's in fact Mexico that is Cuba's main oil supplier. And that's been the case for some time. So you spoke about Sheinbaum and red lines here. I'm wondering if you think that there will be some effort on the part of the Trump administration to try and pressure Mexico away from providing oil to Cuba? And if you think that there's any chance that happens as a part of these negotiations?
We're already seeing it from the Gusano lobby. Maria Elvira Salazar, Jimenez, they've all talked about this. And they are clearly upset with it because it's true. Mexico is now the largest supplier of oil to Cuba now because of Venezuela's difficulty in being able to provide it in this case. And it's not even so much about the oil that is sent. It's what Cuba then does with it. Some of it is used for domestic energy needs, but some of it is just simply sold internationally. That's how Cuba has access to hard currency. I imagine that is a similar scenario with Mexico, the diesel mostly that we sell to Cuba. And I do think that one of the ways we're going to see an effort to kind of constrain Mexico's ability to do that is going to be through these USMCA revisions that are happening this year. There were some leaks to El País, the Spanish newspaper, around what the actual U.S. demands are, and they're extraordinary. They basically want to have a veto power over Mexico's economic policy. And I think part of it is going to be, we can tell you to not sell oil to Cuba if we want to. I don't think the Mexican government under Claudia Sheinbaum is going to go for it, but that's going to be the pressure. And I think they're so emboldened after what just happened here in the region that they're going to go for the maximal demands. In fact, I think it was actually this morning that Claudia was asked about this, and she kind of downplays it. Listen, if you look at the numbers, clearly Mexico is filling in the gap that Venezuela has left behind when it comes to oil shipments to Cuba. Clearly, obviously. And it requires special logistics because you can't use the same tankers that you use for sales to the US to sell to Cuba because of the embargo. But she downplays it. She says, no, it's nothing extraordinary. It's just us selling things. But for me, it's obvious that it's definitely. And I actually think it would be better for us to say so explicitly, to say, this is our resources. We can sell who the hell we want. Don't tell us what to do. I think that would be better, but she's probably also being careful because of the unpredictability of Trump.
I wanted to ask about sanctions more broadly on Venezuela, mainly because when Iran's protests come up, oftentimes the refrain from American establishment conservatives like Mike Pompeo is that Tehran's mullahs have impoverished Iran in the same way that socialism impoverished Venezuela. And I wanted to just get clarification from you. How much of Venezuela's economic situation can be attributed to actual economic mismanagement, if we can use a neutral term? And how much of it is intentional American sabotage, intentional impoverishment on the part of the United States?
The single most important factor in Venezuela's economic challenges is the U.S. blockade of its economy. Venezuela is an oil state. It is its number one commodity. Despite efforts to diversify, which they've actually done a really good job of, they have food sovereignty virtually these days, which is it's not the case before. It's still at the heart of the Venezuelan economy. It always has been, right? Even the Bolivarian Revolution was basically an effort to redistribute that same oil rent, but differently, as opposed to going to executives and kind of the primary oil sector and the associated secondary sector of actually kind of spreading it far wider. And it makes sense in a certain way, right? Like if you have this resource that the whole world wants to buy, you should try to continue to use it, leverage it to your favor to be able to have the resources necessary. In a lot of ways, it does make the construction of a socialist project far easier, as we did see, certainly in the early years of the Bolivarian Revolution. But of course, it has its limitations. And people always talk about, well, the crisis started before the sanctions ever came in. Yeah, because there was a global oil crisis at one point. The price of oil collapsed. And when you have this heavy oil that Venezuela produces, it makes it even less profitable to extract it. The long lines for foodstuffs in 2014, 2015, around that period, right? That was a product of their reliance on importation, because when you have an economy that has a single critical commodity like oil, everything gets built around it. So it doesn't even make sense to invest in agriculture unless it's a political decision, because it's always cheaper to just import things because you're full of dollars. Obviously, there has to be that political conviction to change things. And again, I really want to emphasize this. It frustrates me when so-called left critics say, well, why didn't they diversify sooner? Because it's hard. Because it's hard to steer a ship in a different direction. It's a massive enterprise to try to change that. And they did try, and they did go very far. And in fact, as I said earlier, there's actually been this really, really exciting effort to build what they call communal circuits, which is to get the communes themselves involved directly in the production and distribution to the population of their products. For example, my friends came to visit here Mexico, and they brought me coffee made by the commune. Right? This is the kind of thing that just didn't happen before. They would import all their coffee from Colombia. And so there have been really important advances. But everything that they were doing, and this always has to be at top of mind, was also being done with constant threats from the United States, constant interference, constant undermining, which makes it incredibly difficult. It's very easy for us to pontificate and talk about what could or couldn't happen, but really imagine being in that situation of trying to figure out, especially in kind of the more modern times in these more recent period, of how to get around the sanctions, right? How to figure out just, even if they have to sell it at a discount, but getting that oil out there to be able to get that revenue, to be able to invest in social services and programs and infrastructure to try to rebuild the economy after being devastated by the crisis on the one hand, and also the sanctions. And so having a bit of an appreciation for what it actually means to do all of that, which I think there was a determined effort to do. Of course, there was also, these kind of really scandalous cases of corruption and things like that, which is also important to see. These were key figures that were accused of corruption, and they were taken down by the Venezuelan state. They were removed from their position over these accusations of corruption, which I think is also important. I'm not going to say that everybody in the Venezuelan government was a saint when it came to this, and that everybody was free of misconduct around the stewardship of the country's resources. But I remember covering those stories when they happened at the time. And the message from the government is that this is not acceptable. This is a counter-revolutionary act. You are betraying the people by doing this. And I think that also sent an important message in terms of what is the Bolivarian Revolution really all about? And it's still the same vision. It's still a socialism at heart. It's about trying to figure out a different model for its political economy.
Yeah, I want to ask about that directly. And I'm glad you brought that in because, I see a lot of contemporary discussions about Venezuela that really just kind of start the clock in 2013 with the end of the commodity boom, Chavez's death, and Nicolas Maduro assuming power. And then, of course, the imposition of sanctions starting in 2017 and economic troubles since then. But Venezuela has been a target of U.S. imperialism for a long time, for successive administrations, going back to the late 90s and with a coup attempt in 2002, like right in the heart of the war on terror when our attention was supposedly elsewhere. So can you just talk a bit about what Chavismo was at that time and why it posed such a threat to the United States?
Well, imagine the example it sets. You can actually take your resources and spend them on the population in a country where that basically had never happened before. And Venezuela is interesting in the sense that they used to talk about how it was one of the most stable economies, how it didn't really have the same problems of like the dictatorships that we saw in the southern cone of South America. But it was a fake democracy. In fact, that's why Hugo Chavez won, because he called it out for what it was. It was not the pacto punto fijo is the term, right? Which was quite literally an agreement made by the dominant bourgeois parties to alternate in power. Like, you get a turn and then we get a turn. And it actually never actually delivered tangible material improvements to Venezuelan people's lives. Remember, Hugo Chavez launched his own coup as a military officer in the 90s and then becomes elected. Right? Imagine what is the mindset of a population that says, hey, let's select the guy who tried to stage a coup. Well, because that's how desperate things were. Remember, before Hugo Chavez, there was the Caracazo, the huge, arguably kind of the first mass uprising against neoliberalism in Latin America. So the conditions were there for a break, for something different. And that's what Chavismo was. And even Hugo Chavez used to say very early on that he was kind of a third wayist. He would say, well, no, not capitalism, more socialism, and then he realized that was not. He was a very studious man. And apparently he would sleep not more than 4 hours a night because he was always reading and asking his ministers. He used to call people up at 2 a.m. and be like, tell me about this. And he would read a book, like he was a big fan of Mesaros, for example, when he started learning about communes and the Chinese experience with communes and things like that. So he was always seeking the answer. How do we actually break away from capitalism? He ultimately settled on the commune, for example, saying commune or nothing. Of course, like you said, and a lot of people can then kind of forget all of that. And there definitely was less of an emphasis on the communes for a period there after the death of Hugo Chavez, because also, like we said, it happened to coincide with an economic pressure on the government. Maduro obviously could never fill his shoes, right? Hugo Chavez was a figure that was larger than life. And I was recently on a show with VJ who told this anecdote that Maduro told him personally that he didn't even want it. That when he went to Cuba to talk to Hugo Chavez as he was dying, that Chavez said, "You're my man. It's got to be you." And that Maduro didn't want it because it was just too overwhelming of a prospect for him. Of course, he obviously did accept and I think rose to the occasion. But in that moment, there was certainly a bit of a distraction from what Hugo Chavez had been talking about when it comes to the commune project, for example. However, after Maduro picked up the pieces, and it did involve concessions to the Venezuelan bourgeoisie, right? There were concessions to capital in the Bolivarian Revolution for a period to kind of stabilize things. But as soon as things were stable, he turned right back to the communes. And that has been the emphasis since. And it's still the emphasis now, right? Obviously, Delcy right now has to think about how to keep the country together. But there's still an emphasis that really the bet's on the communes, the bet's on the socialist project. The bet is on trying to figure out still what it means to imagine a different way of organizing our economy. That is the case today. Like I talk about my colleagues there, for example, they are communards. They are active in their commune. They are part of the productive process. They are the ones who are building organizations like the Communard Union, the Unión Comunera, which is trying to imagine a national network of these spaces of self-government with a socialist vision. That is all still there. And that is still at the heart of it. That's also why we've seen, for example, these voting initiatives. It's not a lot of money. I think each project gets around $10,000, right? But it is the direct exercise, without intermediaries, of the population over the country's resources, where they decide democratically what's going to happen. And so that is, for me, an interesting seed of what it can look like, because then you get a glimpse of it. Then you can understand, you're like, oh, I don't have to respond to a boss. We can decide together what our productive capacities actually deliver, and then decide what we do with the surplus. For example, at the height of the crisis, the commune El Panal, which is in Caracas, when there was a lack of medicine, for example. You know what they would do when they would have a family member bring them? They would collectivize it. They would say, then they wouldn't be like, oh, I'm going to hoard this diabetes medicine. They would say, who in our community needs it most? And we're going to decide how to distribute it then. That is extraordinary. That kind of thing doesn't exist in a lot of places in the world. And I think is also part of what is so threatening about the Bolivarian Revolution, that you actually, even under the hardest of circumstances, continue to build socialism.
Something that Gustavo Petro has been invoking in terms of the image of Simón Bolívar is that revitalized specter of Gran Colombia, that state that he built in the early 19th century that encompassed not only Colombia and Venezuela and Panama, but also the Dominican Republic, Peru, Bolivia. There was this attempt to incorporate pretty much all of Latin and South America under a single banner. Now, Petro is speaking literally when he supports the revitalization of this country. I think Hugo Chavez also suggested the same. What's baked in there at the heart of it, at the very least, is a unified Latin South American policy of defense, of standing together in one axis against the United States. I wanted to ask, what are the plausible moves that can actually be taken in that direction? And two, how likely is that sort of unified front, not just individual defenses like you've been talking about?
Yeah, we really should have listened to Simón Bolívar. He actually explicitly had proposed at one point a unified defense strategy, that it wouldn't be at the nation state level, but at the regional level. And interestingly enough, I came across this very recently. He proposed that. Mexico didn't accept it, and Mexico shortly later lost half its territory. I wonder if that story would have been different had we actually listened to Simón Bolívar and actually created that. There was an effort to create a kind of regional defense strategy through UNASUR, the Union of South American Republics, which was also an initiative of Hugo Chavez in his day. UNASUR doesn't exist anymore. It was killed. It's virtually dead. I think there's a skeleton of it left, but it's not really an organization anymore. But part of it had a defense council. The idea was to have a made in Latin America defense strategy, to have trainings for officers here as opposed to in the School of the Americas. And I think part of the reason that they killed UNASUR was because this was a possibility. This was always something that would have undermined U.S. military power in the region. And it played an important role during the crisis in Bolivia, for example. UNASUR was the key regional organization that lowered the temperature when there was that effort to kind of carve out a piece of Bolivia, which happened to be the heart of the base of the right-wing reaction there, but also where the resources are, kind of the wealthiest part of the country, where the gas was. And it was UNASUR that was able to settle things down there. And it showed that it was effective. And that's why I think it was destroyed. There was a deliberate effort to lean on right-wing leaders to undermine it and ultimately destroy it. which I think is also something worth saying here, which is a point that Guillaume Long recently made as well around the fact that CELAC wasn't really able to make a firm condemnation of what happened. CELAC is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which is kind of an alternative to the OAS. Both UNASUR and CELAC operated on a consensus model. And I think that was a huge mistake. Majorities need to be built, right? And the majority should be the ones to exercise that authority over minorities when it comes to this. This emphasis on consensus, I think, was a huge mistake and needs to be abandoned because it allowed for the destruction of UNASUR. CELAC still exists. It was rescued by Andrés Manuel López Obrador. It was virtually on its deathbed as well. And so to answer your question in terms of its potential, I don't think it's there. Not until people reckon with the reality before us of understanding that playing by the rules of the game that used to exist is not going to work anymore, that there has to be a reconfiguration of our relation. And I've always said that I think if you can't reach consensus, then work with the people who will. Maybe Mexico and Colombia should have conversations about mutual defense agreements. If they're the only ones who are willing to do it, to have these that also will extend beyond the life of an individual government, right? Because the political winds can change, but there needs to be something that can provide some kind of stability when it comes to that. I think it's really, really more important. Otherwise, what we're probably going to see is nuclear proliferation. So Latin America, the countries have signed the Tlatelolco Agreement, which bans nuclear weapons in the region. CELAC itself, at one point, declared the region a zone of peace. But if you have the United States threatening you the way that they're threatening Venezuela, I wouldn't be surprised if people start coming to this conclusion of, well, if we have to go it alone, we have to have the only weapon that can actually protect us, which is a nuclear weapon. Is that the world we want to live in? It's not the world I want to live in. But if this is the world that is emerging, then I also think if that's the only strategy left, then that's the one we should pursue. And I feel like most people would come to that conclusion, but that makes for a more dangerous world.
I think that this challenge of recognizing the new rules of the game, this switch to domination and force in a more overt sense is critical around the world, but it's also critical at home here in the United States. And one thing that we've seen with the Trump administration, at least in this term, in an accelerated form, right, is that shift to a mode of domination and repression through the same apparatus, really, that apparatus built on population control domestically as well. And I think we'd be remiss not to mention just an hour before this interview, ICE was met with protests in Minneapolis and opened fire on a protester, shooting her in the face and murdering her in cold blood. And I think that the challenge of reacting to these new forces of domination and thinking towards collective self-defense and new strategies for opposition needs to be a conversation that we're having here in the United States, in addition to these kind of larger strategies of resistance that are happening elsewhere in the world.
I totally agree. I was actually going to bring that up as well. I think at some point, people are going to have to reckon with the notion that they're dealing with a Gestapo, which has pretty much legal authority to murder people in cold blood, as you just said. What do you do about that? I mean, if it were here, the response to the violent repression, the murderous repression against the left in Central America, here in Mexico, the dirty war, was self-defense, armed self-defense. That may be the place where the United States is headed. I mean, certainly if I lived in the United States, that's what I'd start thinking about, is how am I going to protect myself and my community? And it's not something that's outside of the history of the United States. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which was its full name, was about that. Was about the Black community being tired of being assassinated in cold blood by state forces. So there's probably going to be a need to answer that question. And that's not a question for me to answer. I can speak to our experiences with it. And even to bring back in Venezuela with this, right? I think part of the reason, as we said, that they didn't attempt an occupation was because they knew that there are millions of guns in the hands of workers in Venezuela and that it wasn't going to be quite so easy. And in fact, there's these really powerful images right now circulating of, the much demonized colectivos riding around on motorcycles with heavy weaponry, as it should be. Let them know this is a peaceful revolution, but it is not unarmed.
Jose, thank you for joining us. This has been an amazing conversation.
No, thank you so much for having me. I really feel we got into some really important points here that I think only an show like this would be able to really get into it.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
All right. And thank you for your solidarity. I think maybe that'll be my final message to anybody who's listening. If you made it this far, obviously you understand the need for us to link our forces and to understand kind of the global dimensions of what's happening. I've been really encouraged to see the spontaneous mass demos that have been happening as a result. There's a day of action happening right around the corner as well. If you're able to turn out, do what you can. You know, before we went on air, I mentioned that I broke my hand in the earthquake, and it's been quite difficult to work under these conditions. Thankfully, I have, access to Social Security here in Mexico and medicine and painkillers and medical attention. But I'm, pushing through and powering through because the moment demands it of us. And I've always tried to end on a more optimistic note. I want to say that obviously what happened on Saturday was heartbreaking. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but much of my political compass is due to my interactions with Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution. I visited the country for the first time in 2005 for the World Festival of Youth and Students. And I always say that I arrived a social democrat and I left a communist. And I left a communist because of the generosity of the Venezuelan people to teach me about revolution and what it means and what is mass power and popular power, what it means to seize the resources of your country and to finally benefit from them. And it really, I will forever owe a debt of gratitude to Venezuela. But this was a hard thing to witness. Like I said, I'm on painkillers, and I literally thought I was hallucinating when I first saw the messages about what had happened. And it was only until I confirmed it that I finally settled on it. Nonetheless, we've been through this. The left in Latin America in particular, we survived the brutal dictatorships of the Southern Cone. Here in Mexico, the left survived the dirty war. In Colombia, the political genocide against the Unión Patriótica. I mean, there are so many examples. The counterinsurgency campaigns of Central America. We've endured. We'll endure this one too. Eventually, we will be able to rebuild our forces and we'll be able to push back. I want people to really take that home with them, to understand that they may have the helicopters and the bombs and all the technology in the world, but they don't have the people. There's always more of us. And we have to get our shit together. But we will. We will. And when we do, we're going to win.
God willing, there will be many more humiliations for America and its allies in the future. Take care of yourself.
Resistencia está en todo el mundo, está en África, está en el Asia, en el Medio Oriente, está en América Latina, el Caribe, y a ellos se suman los pueblos que luchan contra el neoliberalismo, contra el racismo, que luchan contra las distintas formas de colonialismo, colonialismo político, el colonialismo económico, el colonialismo cultural, o el colonialismo digital, que es el que está en desarrollo ahora a través de las redes sociales. Colonialismo digital, cultural, todos los que luchamos contra el colonialismo, todos los que luchamos por la descolonización de la mente y de nuestros pueblos, formamos parte del eje de la resistencia frente a las maneras imperiales de tratar de imponer la hegemonía en el mundo. El siglo XXI es nuestro siglo, es el siglo de la unión de los pueblos, de la liberación de los pueblos, es el siglo de la justicia, de la verdad. Los imperios están en fase de decadencia y los proyectos de los pueblos por la felicidad, el desarrollo y la grandeza apenas están empezando. Este es nuestro siglo.